Walthea, take it away then. It's just muted there, Walthea, actually.
Okay. Julie, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm wondering, when you saw the topic for today, how to have a difficult conversation, what popped into your mind? When you think of difficult conversation, what examples can you think of difficult conversations? In just a minute, I'm going to be putting you into breakout rooms and giving you a chance to share some examples of difficult conversations. And then I would also like you to discuss what factors make a conversation difficult. So is everybody clear on what we're doing? Yeah. So just work on the technology here on getting everybody into a breakout room. Okay, welcome back. I'm just going to ask for you to unmute yourself and give some examples of difficult conversations.
Something that came up for us, we were saying, saying no to something, something that you feel for whatever reason that you don't want to do, saying no to it, but also even saying yes to some things as well. It's you can kind of have it either way. But yeah, those can kind of be difficult conversations, something that came up for us.
And we were also saying that...
Yeah, we were talking...
Oh, sorry, who's the...
No, you go ahead, go ahead.
I'll go ahead. We're also saying that sometimes if you're prepared for them, it might help, but if you're not prepared, they come out of the blue, it can get quite emotional, or your voice can get quite shaky, or you're not ready for it, especially if it's confrontation in situations.
Yeah, we were talking about two things actually. One was managing upwards in work, and maybe having to ask for like a salary increase. Like that can sometimes be a difficult conversation because you're asking for something that you need, and it's not always easy to ask for something that you need. And the other conversation that we were having was around friendships, and the fear of loss, I suppose, or around having a conversation with a friend that maybe you don't feel you're again getting what you need from the friendship.
Yeah. So you were discussing a mix of factors that are making a conversation difficult. So one of the factors is who the conversation is with and your relationship to them. Another factor could be your internal self and the timing of the conversation, and how you feel about saying no to people. What were some other factors that might make a conversation difficult?
I guess past experiences, so how the other party has dealt with a conversation in the past, or we can tell ourselves stories and say, or generalize and say, oh, he's going to be difficult, he's going to raise his voice, he's going to storm out. So we can almost plan in advance what we think might go wrong, when in fact that might not be the fact at all.
Yeah. So fortune telling about what's going to happen in the conversation based on your past experiences. My objective for today is to show you a model of how to prepare better for conversations. And what we found is people find conversations difficult when they're going to suffer if they don't have the conversation, but equally having the conversation is risky. And what helps to reduce the risk and the stress of the conversation is being adequately prepared. So what I'm presenting today is a model from the Harvard Negotiation Project. Now, for purposes of this presentation, I have actually significantly simplify this model. And I was thinking back to when Jason Moran was giving a presentation here about procrastination. And I think that that's a factor in difficult conversations. You have an inkling that a conversation is going to be difficult when you start procrastinating about it, or when you start to be ruminating about it, and you're going over and over in your mind about how it might go and how things maybe went in the past. So having a framework to help yourself prepare, and also having a framework when you're providing training and coaching around having a difficult conversation is helpful, and it increases the opportunity for you to have a constructive conversation. In the Harvard negotiation model, there are 3 levels to a difficult conversation, and you have to prepare for all 3 levels. So the first level is the what happened level, and most difficult conversations are about what happened or what should happen. The next level is the feelings level, and we're going to, when we get to this level, we're going to share as a group some things that we've done to prepare for this level, and also to provide training and coaching for other people around this particular level. And the third level is the identity level, and the identity level helps to explain why a conversation might be difficult for me, but not difficult for you. So moving to the first level of a conversation, when you're preparing for a conversation, your goal is to have a constructive conversation and to uncover the information you need to move forward constructively. And we all have blind spots. So it's important to get everyone's perspective about what's happened, which is level 1. So the first obstacle to having a constructive conversation at this level is the truth assumption. And this is where you say, if the other person just understood the facts, problem solved. So if the employee just understood we don't have flexi time, then the problem would be solved. The reality is that difficult conversations aren't about what the contract says, they're about what the contract means. So it's not necessarily about the fact that the employee is showing up late, but what that behavior means to the manager and the rest of the group. The next obstacle to finding out what happened is the blame game. So if you've just lost an important client, everyone is covering their backside, and it's going to be difficult to have a conversation about what happened. The third obstacle to have a difficult conversation is the invention intention, which is a real tongue twister. And this also goes back to another presentation that we had in Dirty Salad Club from Julie, where she was talking about bias. And when we don't have enough information, we tend to invent information. We imagine information. So I'm going to give an example from the last recession. There was a female manager, and she had a direct report in her group called Joe. And Joe was consistently showing up for work late, and it was very critical to the team's performance that he be there timely. And she was thinking back to when Joe worked for John, and he was always very punctual. So she said in her mind, the reason Joe is turning up late is he has a problem with female managers. So she invented an intention for him. But the reality was that his financial situation had changed. And when he had worked for John, he had his own car, and now he was traveling to work on public transportation and using a DART and 2 buses. So having looked at the obstacles, what skills do we need to develop to overcome those obstacles? So the first skill is questioning, learning to ask better questions. And I'm not going to go into detail about this for this group, but think back to your own professional training, that you've already had training on questioning skills, open-ended questions, closed-ended questions. So when you're preparing for a difficult conversation, or you're preparing someone else for a difficult conversation, have them sit down and write out questions that are going to be helpful to the conversation and lead to a constructive conversation. Now, the other skill, which is going to be very obvious to everybody in this group, is listening skills. And to remember, you know, once you ask the questions, you need to be listening. The third skill is separating the intention from the impact. So in my example of the female manager, instead of guessing what you think the person's intention is and bringing that up in the conversation, because you can clearly see if she brings up in the conversation, you have a problem with female managers, that is not going to be leading to a constructive conversation. So instead, to be thinking about what the impact of what he's doing is having. So this is how it's impacting the team. You know, this is how it's impacting me. And in this particular situation, she's feeling very disappointed and frustrated. So we've just looked at the first level, which is the what happened level. Now the next level, which you can see coming up here with the manager being angry and frustrated about what's happening, is the feelings level. And in the feelings level, there are some things that happen that can also block having a constructive conversation. And the first thing that can be blocking a constructive conversation is unexpressed feelings. So think about feelings like being water. And where someone has a lot of strong feelings about something, it's like water rising, and it's rising up and it's eventually covering their ears. So if they're feeling very frustrated about something, they're not going to be able to hear what the other person is saying. So if you're having a discussion with a client and they've been unhappy about your service delivery, they're not going to be able to hear what you're saying until they've had a chance to express their feelings. The next obstacle to having a constructive conversation at this level is leaking feelings. So sometimes people say, I'm going to leave my feelings at the door. You know, this is a business conversation. The problem is that your feelings are going to leak. So for example, you might say to your spouse, is everything okay? And they come back to you, everything's fine. So the feelings are coming out. The third obstacle is erupting feelings. So someone can be quite emotional, but you still really don't know what they're feeling, and it's not moving the conversation forward. Now, the skills that you need to develop to overcome the obstacles in level 2, I don't think are going to be a surprise to anyone on this call, which is using emotional intelligence. So if you look at the EQI definition of emotional intelligence, a set of emotional and social skills that influence the way we perceive and express ourselves, develop and maintain social relationships, cope with challenges, and use emotional information in an effective and meaningful way, you can see how key developing your emotional intelligence is to having constructive conversations that you're perceiving as difficult conversations. If you look at the EQI model, you'll see that it's stressing balancing emotional intelligence skills. And I think that's very important when you're thinking about training and coaching people around emotional intelligence and developing their emotional intelligence, so that it can be very helpful to have taken the EQI before you start training and coaching the participant about difficult conversations. What I'm going to do now is stop sharing and put everyone back on gallery view and have a conversation around what skills of emotional intelligence would you select to focus on when providing training and coaching to clients preparing for difficult conversations. And within that, you might want to be talking about balancing skills. So how do we think about that while I get everybody back on gallery view? So there we all are. So unmute yourself and give us some examples of skills that you would select to focus on when developing your emotional intelligence and providing training and coaching for other people.
Hi. We've touched on it before, but I think the listening to understand, not to respond. I think active listening definitely for me.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Orla here. I think from my perspective, empathy, when you look at the QI model, empathy would be one that would be important to focus on, which is described as, you know, being able to recognize, understand and appreciate. And I think the definition is important in the three contexts. For where somebody else is coming from, because as you say, you know, some of the obstacles are that maybe I come from my perspective and not from the other person's perspective in having the difficult conversation. So that might be one that we could focus on in order to help people have those conversations.
Thank you.
One that I think is very useful as well is just stopping and pausing. Just actually allowing for a silence for something to happen and open up. Quite often we don't do that.
Thank you. So we're rushing off with all of our agenda and not taking a chance to pause.
Yeah, I think it's important to, I think it's important to observe as well, so that we're not caught up in our own thoughts of what am I going to say next and what was my next question. That I suppose it's like open, you know, it's like active listening, but that we're observing for the other person's facial reactions or body language to see how they're really taking in what information you're giving them.
I think kind of linked to that is our own awareness of what reaction we're having to the content of what we're being told, in terms of whether we're having an emotional reaction ourselves and trying to process that, helping to support people in processing that in the moment.
Great, thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in level 3.
One thing I'd like to add is I suppose the more that you know yourself, or the greater the understanding that you have in terms of who you are as a coach, I think you can, I suppose, access your own value system in a way of being able to assess what is being said and how it's being communicated, so that it allows you then to just be, I suppose, well, be as open-minded and non-judgmental. So coming from the emotional intelligence part of it, I think there's a lot to be said about maturity, but also knowing how to handle a difficult situation. So experience will come into play.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
I'd also suggest that it's recognizing that not everybody responds to feedback or difficult conversations in the same way. So to allow for certain people may need to take the information shared, digest it offline, and then come back to a further conversation, as opposed to expecting maybe a resolution in that first conversation. So, you know, some people like to internalize, internalize, take it away and come back. And some people might be able to respond and have a good conversation coming from maybe a difficult start, but ending up in a good place in that one session itself. So just, I suppose, recognizing different people's ways of responding and interpreting and processing information that comes out of a difficult conversation.
Thank you for that.
I think also maybe exploring, helping people to explore how motivated they are to actually resolve the conflict. Is it something that they need to resolve and get involved in? And if it is, what flexibility have they got in terms of possible outcomes as well? You know, how committed are they? How much energy are they willing to put into resolving this issue?
So thank you. That you're pointing out the emotional intelligence piece around flexibility and also around decision making.
Just one that I haven't, you know, people have been mentioning empathy, and I think one that's important as well to balance with empathy is assertiveness. And being able to really stand your ground, say no, be direct, but in a way that's considerate, you know, so kind of balancing that courage with compassion, I think is really important for difficult conversations.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
I think a very important aspect of that is, I suppose, they seem to be, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about seems to be, I suppose, extended to the other, but when you bring it, it's to be aware of what your own feelings and what you know, what's causing those feelings, and then being able to express that. So it's understanding how something is making you feel and then being able to ask for what you want in like a simple way, I suppose, of complicating it.
Yeah, I also think it's a good idea to really think to yourself, like, what's the worst case scenario here? So what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? So that you're almost like preparing yourself for either end of the scale. And being realistic, I suppose, it brings a reality check of what is actually the worst case scenario here.
Thank you. As a way of taking the pressure off.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I suppose because like that, we make assumptions. Sometimes we go down a rabbit hole, but if we take ourselves back up and say, you know, what is really the worst case scenario here? Sometimes it can just bring you back into reality.
Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to point out when we're thinking about preparing training, that in the current situation, I can think of two examples where training around difficult conversations is needed. One example would be HR staff that are facing into having a lot of conversations with people about involuntary redundancies. And another example would be staff that are working in credit management. So when you're thinking about, you know, preparing training programs and, you know, in this conversation, we were talking about the fact of realizing that in the case of talking about involuntary redundancies, that people take on information, you know, at a different speed, and maybe people would need to be taking information away and coming back and having a second conversation about something. And ditto back to the, with the credit staff, the example of balancing empathy with assertiveness. So now I hope I've given you some food for thought about how to be providing training around developing emotional intelligence in preparing for difficult conversations. So now I'd like to move on and discuss the third level of a difficult conversation, which is the, my slides are just, the identity level is explaining why a conversation is more difficult for me than it might be for you. So in this level, this is the level where people can be quite shaken. people will say, I had the conversation and he really pressed my buttons. So this is the level that, as I was saying, can really shake people. So it's thinking of three legs to identity, and if any of those legs get knocked, it can make the conversation more stressful for the person. And so preparing ahead of time can help to make the conversation easier for yourself internally. So as an example, I would be using, say, an example of asking your boss for a raise. Now, on the surface, that looks like it's a conversation about money, but it's actually a conversation about competency. So when someone is going to ask for a raise, if the boss is coming back with examples of maybe where they weren't satisfied with the employee's performance, that can be shaking the person's sense of competency. And competency here is defined as past accomplishments and current successes. The next leg of the identity piece that can get shaken is worthiness. And so worthiness in this model is defined as what someone sees as a good person. So if I ask everybody in this group, how would you define a good person? We would all be coming up with different definitions. So in my example of going and asking for a raise, if someone has a definition of a good person as someone that always puts the interest of the group ahead of their interest, they might have difficulty during a business downturn or a recession going to ask the boss for a raise, even though their role and responsibility might have been significantly increased. The third leg that can get shaken is the leg of belongingness. And we all like to have a sense of connection, and no one wants to feel isolated. So in the midst of a conversation, if someone feels that they're going to get ostracized or lose that sense of belongingness, that can be shaking them in the conversation. Now, there's one skill here to develop to help you to overcome those obstacles. And the skill is actually handling feedback. Now, I'd like everybody, I'd like everybody to raise their hand if they've had experience of having training in giving feedback. So how many people have had training in giving feedback? So there's lots of hands of people who've had experience of training of giving feedback. How many people have had experience of training to receive feedback? And there's a lot less people that have any training in receiving feedback. This is back to where we're good at giving training about how to give it, but not so good about giving training about how to receive it. And I like the illustration about handling feedback that I got from a psychologist called Henry Cloud. Henry Cloud talks about receiving feedback like eating. So when we eat food, some of it gets metabolized and some of it gets flushed down the toilet. And that needs to happen in order to be healthy. If you're only doing one of those, you're going to be in trouble. For example, if you're eating food and you're not able to metabolize it and you're flushing it all down the toilet, you're going to be malnourished. Equally, if you're eating the food and taking everything on board and you're not able to eliminate any of it, you're going to end up in the emergency room. So the same applies to feedback. You need to be able to take some of it on board, but you also need to be able to flush some of it away. So when you're preparing for a difficult conversation and you're looking at those 3 obstacles, be thinking about, your competency, and think about what could come up in this conversation that could be knocking that, and can I take on board, some of the feedback I'm getting, as well as realizing that I can also let go of some of that feedback. So it's moving away from an all or nothing situation when you're receiving feedback from the other person in the conversation. Now, I'm hoping from today's presentation that you're getting ideas about how to effectively prepare for a difficult conversation and how to help other people to effectively prepare. So what I say to clients is move away from ruminating about past conversations or being anxious and worrying about future conversations, but instead put your energy in the present and work on preparing and developing skills for future conversations. For more information about the framework I was using from the Harvard Negotiation Project, I'll refer you to their book, Difficult Conversations. So now I'm going to return to Julie to tell you about what's happening next week.
Thank you so much for that, Walthea. I really enjoyed it. I think there was some really nice imagery there that you used, even just the kind of metaphor of getting feedback being like eating. And I really like the one about, feelings being like water rising until they kind of cover your ears. So it was really nice imagery there. But yeah, thank you so much for that. On the 15th of July is the next time we're meeting together, and we have Niamh Hannon hosting, and she is talking all about self-care for yourself and helping promote it in with your clients or in organizations. So I'm looking forward to that one as well. But I think we have a couple of minutes. So if anyone has any questions or wants to discuss anything further, I suppose we can just kind of open the floor up to anyone who wants to say anything.
Yeah, I'm willing to ask, wait, I'll do stop share here. Yeah, I'm willing to answer questions. I'm also trying to help everyone with their Zoom fatigue and letting them have a little bit of time between meetings, but I'll definitely take a couple questions. I don't know if anybody's got anything in the chat box.
By labeling them difficult conversations, that people go into that emotional home of this is going to be negative with the emotional, what it does to your biochemistry. Would it be better, like you've suggested, to label it as a constructive conversation or a courageous conversation? And I've never found the right word, by the way, so I'm super interested in any views you'd have.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm coming from a cognitive behavioral viewpoint, and fortune telling is unhealthy. So if you're going in there already with a scenario of what's going to happen, you're not going in there with a very open mind. So changing it around to thinking about, when I've had previous situations and I've had conversations and how well they've turned out and how I have been able to resolve things in the past, even though it might not particularly be with in this particular situation. So sometimes, let's take the example of negotiation skills. Sometimes people might have very good negotiation skills in their professional life, but then say they're not able to negotiate at home, and helping people to say, I can transfer those skills into another situation. And that's also back to looking at, back to the EQI assessment, having that assessment and be able to look at what are my strengths and how can I leverage them, and thinking about how I can be using those constructively. So definitely, and having a growth mindset.
That's brilliant. And I was thinking in terms of even when you label it across a company, if you call a program difficult conversations, I think people have an emotive reaction to that. But you've reminded me something of I need to negotiate at home, so thank you.
I was just wondering, Walthea, whether, you know, what your thoughts are in terms of using the models across generations, if you like, in terms of any nuances in terms of the different generational gaps and stuff like that, maybe where older mentors are working with younger mentees, or you've got different age groups working together with different cultural backgrounds and expectations and so on.
I think that comes back to, you know, Julie's presentation about bias and that whole bit about inventing intentions for people. And this is also something about labeling. I think we're really quick to see someone's age and label them and come up with a whole bunch of assumptions about them. And it's working on realizing that they have a different perspective than us, and that perspective is healthy and is going to contribute to problem solving. So you know, there's been a lot of articles about reverse mentoring and how important it is to have, you know, younger age people mentoring people from an older generation. So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Thank you.
I actually am, just to give all of you a bit of breathing space before your next Zoom call, I'm actually going to close, and I'm personally very much looking forward to the session in 2 weeks' time on self-care. So I really appreciated the opportunity to hear all of your ideas today about improving training in the whole area of emotional intelligence and having more constructive conversations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.